Hello, I'm Vienna,
I'm Josh.
and welcome to the podcast where we're going to be grappling with the water dancer. And so, to start off, we're going to be talking about some of the Southern Gothic elements that can be derived from not only the water dancer, but from previous books that we read, like Beloved and Benito Sereno. And so, we're going to start off with this so we can kind of sprinkle in these details throughout the rest of the podcast.
So the first Southern Gothic element we can see in the water dancer is conduction as the supernatural.
And so we see this in the context of like Ryland's jail. He's in a pit. This is the beginning of the second part, and he has to play a game where he has to run as fast as he can away from the white men and the slaves, so he can get away. But this is only for the entertainment of the slave owners. And no matter how hard he tries to learn the terrain and he tries to gain strategies to escape, he's always thwarted and he's always beaten. He's always losing, and it makes Haram feel, and not only Haram but like all of slavery, all the slaves think that this is an uphill battle and we're never going to win this. And so this is like the psychological effects that are not really told to us, because I didn't learn this in school. Did you? No. And so that kind of goes in with the quote Frederick Douglass said, "My part has been to tell the story of the slave, a story of the master never wanted for narrators." And so kind of like this story is not told often enough.
These are the unsaid, like what Vienna was saying about what Frederick Douglass's quote. These are the unsaid, the gruesome things that happened to Hiram in Ryland's jail. Those details that we never learned about, and just the terrible things that happen. And unless he uses the power of conduction, he was never going to escape that little game of entertainment and messing with the prisoners' minds, of allowing them to try and run away. And the lesson from here that can be learned and derived is that unless he uses his supernatural power, he wouldn't escape. And there's an emphasis that in reality there isn't a supernatural power. And so imagine how difficult it was for Hiram, and then imagine how difficult it was in the real world where you didn't have that supernatural ability, and so your chances of surviving that, your chances of escaping that are so slim. And even if you did escape it, those psychological effects Vienna was talking about, they're never going to leave you, and it could take as long as generations to overcome.
So the next concept we're going to be talking about is the concept of the grotesque, which in this scenario means kind of something not accepted by society, something distorted, ugly, and something not natural, like doesn't belong. And so in this story, the grotesque is the exposing of the Southern culture and like the quality of the task system, but we'll get into that later. But to the slave owner, to the white man point of view, Mr. Fields or Mr. Bland is seen as grotesque because he's working with the Underground Railroad. And the Underground Railroad, to them, is grotesque in the first place, because to them, the slaves are just tools and for profit, and they think they shouldn't be free because they're not really that human.
Furthermore, the dehumanizing erases another version of the grotesque is the dehumanizing that the slave owners put upon the slaves. Even though they were slaves and trying to keep their culture, the point of dehumanizing them was so that they would lose their culture, this grotesque, lose their identities. The grotesque, again, according to the slave owners. And we see closer to the end of the book that Howell even felt guilty for what he had done in his life, and earlier even told Hiram this, where this is kind of exposing the Southern culture from even a member of the Southern culture, by showing that even he felt guilty, and also exposing the Southern culture. It could be the grotesque is that people of the Southern culture just didn't want to change. Another form of the grotesque that we see Coates expose is the dehumanizing. We see that the slave owners dehumanize the slaves to the point where they're erasing their culture. And even though they were slaves and trying to keep their identities, trying to keep their culture, the point of dehumanizing them was so that they would lose their culture and identities, also known as the grotesque, according to the slave owners. We see closer to the end of the book that Howell felt guilty for what he had done in his life. And earlier in the book, we see that he was telling Hiram that he doesn't feel he's permitted to inherit Lockless. And he recognizes Hiram's potential, and because of the culture, he can't allow himself to be the heir. So from this, we can see that he views Hiram in some ways more than just profit. He's not dehumanizing them, but we also have to consider that he never even brought him in until he recognized his talents. He's still living up to this culture. In fact, he is the head of the place. Okay.
And the grotesque is the fact that he refuses to change.
Exactly. And the grotesque is also that he even admits that there's something faulty in the system, but still, it can kind of show us what we learned earlier in the semester, that some people just they're afraid to change, and they refuse to change because then it seems like they're wrong.
Okay, so now let's get into the actual book, and we'll talk about first the title of the book. It's called The Water Dancer. It's called this because when Hiram first does conduction, he envisions his mother water dancing at the Goose Bridge. The Goose Bridge is described as a bridge between the land of the living and the land of the lost during the first chapter. And this bridge is spiritual to Hiram because of this connection to his mother and because he saw her dancing at this bridge. And the showing of the actual mother dancing is also foreshadowed into the further down in the book, where he actually learns that his memories are what fuels the conduction, and the memories that he's blocking out. And so he blocked out painful memories of his mother, and so when he remembers them again, he conducts. Now, do you remember the origin of the water dance itself?
Yeah, so we can learn about the origin from both Harriet and Sophia talking to Hiram. In terms of Sophia, she was telling Hiram the origin of water dancing. There was a big king who came from Africa on a slave ship with his people. They killed all the white people on the ship, and they tried to go home, but something went wrong. And the white people were coming. The king told them to jump into the water to sing and dance because the water goddess had them and would bring them back home. When they dance with water on their head, they are praising the ones in the present time of the book. When people do water dancing, they're giving praise and remembering these people, these water dancers in this story. And they're flipping the negative, difficult situation into a positive, working with what they have. It takes a lot of strength to be able to do this.
It does take a lot of strength, but it also is kind of liberating as well.
What do you mean?
And so it's liberating because it's a way to escape slavery. And so you're regaining these lost memories, and that slavery is pushed down deep inside of you and you refuse to remember. And it's liberating because you're remembering it and you're facing the trauma that slavery has caused.
Oh, this is actually like how literal water dancing is liberating, because it's a source of happiness to do the water dancing. As you can see described during the holiday when they're water dancing, and as Sophia was explaining to Hiram, water dancing is a way to make good out of the negative. And it's a way to spend time being happy while you're in a difficult situation.
And so for Hiram, memories is a huge part of his identity. And so by doing conduction and by regaining his memories, he is further liberating himself. And during conduction, you experience and see these memories. He's physically experiencing them again. And this could be a connection to Setha's beloved, where she experiences rememory as well. But in the water dancer, this rememory is being put into a power, being put into a use.
So later we read about Harriet explaining conduction, and here are a couple of quotes that she said. The first one being, "For memory is the chariot, and memory is the way, and memory is a bridge from the curse of slavery to the boon of freedom." The second quote that she said was, "We forgot nothing, you and I. To forget is to truly slave, to forget is to die."
So what do you think this all means?
So for starters, I think that it means that if they forget, if they don't face this trauma, then they're allowing the slave owners to win. They're not facing it and they're not healing from it. What do you think?
I think, yeah, that makes sense, because conduction is powered by memories, right?
Exactly.
And you need to unlock the memories first to gain conduction, and that conduction helps liberate people from slavery. So, in a literal sense, remembering these things leads to liberation. Okay, so talking about conduction itself, Harriet describes it as dancing, and she says, no exertions needed, it's just like dancing. But it's not actually, you're not physically dancing. It's like dancing, and when you're not, you feel this trauma, and you're not feeling this sense of liberation. You're not flipping that negative. And by working with what you have, by acknowledging the memories, retelling them in a story during conduction, facing the trauma, Haram is dancing, liberating himself and other people from slavery. And so this conduction builds a bridge between slavery and freedom.
In fact, the more you remember, the farther you can be conducted.
That's true, which shows the power these memories have.
We see that when Harriet and Hiram perform conduction, as we said, they're reliving these stories. They're talking about them. They're watching them play out. Just like Setha and Paul D in Beloved were re-experiencing these stories on such a deep level, both were experiencing rememory. So here in conduction, they tend to feel very exhausted, very melancholy after experiencing these memories. And we think that this is because they're facing all these traumatic experiences. They're bringing them up again. And conduction, if they don't do this, while they're pushing down the memories, they're not facing the trauma. And that's why they feel less melancholy. That's why they feel less exhausted.
But isn't that like a contradiction, though? Because of these feelings of melancholy, wouldn't that mean they're not really liberating themselves?
So we could answer that perhaps over time he'll be facing the trauma more and it will get easier. But like we said, this can take a lot of time to get over.
Well, the problem is Harry has been doing this for a long time. She's been doing conduction for a long time, and even this part she seems wiped out. It usually doesn't take much out of her, and in this part she says, sometimes it takes more than other times, and on those former times, well, you've seen what happened. I have made this jump so many times before, though. No idea why this one shocked me so. So, I don't know. Maybe they're not liberating themselves. Maybe they're liberating the future generations that they're going to have. Because slavery can take a lot of time, and I don't know, maybe there's no saving the individual person going through it, but maybe your kids can be saved, and maybe through conduction and through liberating these memories, your kids will have a better future and a better life.
Another potential support for feeling liberation when facing this trauma, feeling liberation when conducting, is that we see in the book that Hiram described Harriet's glowing, the green glowing, as a light that formed out of the darkness. And I think that this can represent the light being liberation and the darkness being the trauma, the memories. So when she's facing this trauma, when she's facing this darkness, there's a light that forms as a result.
So when Haram and Harriet do conduction, they have to have a body of water nearby. And we ask ourselves, why do they need water? And one of the things we came up with was because of the story Sophia told them, that the water goddess would save them and bring them back into freedom. And so maybe this water goddess is still controlling it, but is asking for memories to transport them. And also, water has always been a symbol of a rebirth. And so maybe by using this water, they're rebirthing themselves through conduction and to get them out of slavery. But is conduction really a good thing, though? Like, is it good that Harriet and Haram are facing these memories and trauma again?
It's a good question. So I think that it's not really for us to say. We didn't experience it like we were talking about in class. So while we can read about it and try to understand it, at the same time, we don't know what it's truly like. I think it's important to note that for us personally, maybe we'd like to remember some memories. At the same time, these memories were horrible. And so there isn't fully a benefit. You could say that there's a benefit of having the power of conduction. Still, at the same time, we didn't experience it. We don't know the amount of pain that it might bring. I think that it's important also to note that there's a difference between judging if Hiram should try to remember versus if it's a good thing. It is not for us to decide, because no matter what you learn, unless you experience it, it can't be emphasized enough. It's not the same.
Okay, so the next part we're going to be talking about the quality and the task. And so the quality represents the slave owners, and the task represents the slaves. And so this is kind of the unsaid and the grotesque version, um, talking about the elements of Southern Gothic. But we do see the difference between the official narrative of the slave owner, slave, between what's written here. Because there's this different narrative, and like the Frederick Douglass quote says, "My part has been to tell the story of the slave, the story of the master never wanted for narrators." They don't want to tell about all the horrors and the mistreatment that they do to these slaves.
And that's essentially why they cover themselves up by the term quality. So part of this untold narrative that we see is that the quality hided the oppression. We can see this through the architecture of Lockless that Hiram was explaining. And he describes how everything looks so good, but it was really because of the hard work of the slaves. And he expressed his frustration that all their credit was being taken. It also describes how the tunnels, the warrens, this part of the architecture was hidden, so it still seemed like the quality were doing the work. The work of the slaves wasn't being shown, it wasn't being emphasized. He also describes how there were books, there were maps in Howell's home, and from the perspective of someone who lived with them, he was describing that they weren't even being used, they were just for show and a sign of power. And this task, this label, was just to show their profit, just to show the task that they were performing.
Yeah. So the main task is meant to only signify that these people are used for tasks. Their whole identity is of tasks. And even when they're supposedly free, they're still called free tasks. So they're still defined by what they did before. And the name quality sticks to everyone that's a slave owner, even though throughout the book we see these people aren't really quality. And a big example of this is Maynard. And even Hiram admits that he doesn't know how to hide that he's not quality. And also throughout the book, there's mention of Virginia starting to fail in their economy. Well, that's because slaves are being sold away and there's not enough of them. And so that really shows that the slaves were the glue that held everything together, and it's definitely not the quality that's doing any of this. And Howell even recognizes it when he's talking to Hiram, like you mentioned before. He recognizes his potential, but he refuses to change. He feels he's not permitted to change and give Hiram the heir of Lockless.
So we see that Howell did not care for Hiram until he realized his gifts, how he could profit from him. And he didn't see him for his humanity, for being his son. So this furthers the discussion about the dehumanizing that was going on. And the novel makes slaves seem more human, as a matter of fact, by exposing this. So Coates is exposing Howell, is exposing the Southern culture like we were talking about before, and showing that the humanity exists more amongst the slaves than amongst the slave owners. And also, another thing we realize is the more you dehumanize, the less humanized you become. So there's that irony as well. So that irony of the more you dehumanize, the less human you become. So the irony, what she's exposing, is that the quality really aren't quality, like we said. They're the less humans, while the tasks are the more humans.
Furthermore, Coates is exposing Southern culture through Hiram's perspective and using the representation of the quality in the task. She's showing that even though these buildings and this land might be beautiful, we have to recognize what or who built it. And so a lot of these architecture is built by blood, so it may not be as beautiful as it seems. But back to the book. When Hiram started living in the house instead of the other task, what do you think his expectations were, and why do you think he was later disappointed?
So I think deep down his expectations were that he was going to be treated like family, that he was going to be treated differently. And Thena warned him not to think this way. And what he realized is there was no difference. He wasn't seen as a human. He wasn't seen as a part of the family. Rather, he was there because he was for profit. And he realized that they aren't even a people of quality. And they just steal the credit, like we were saying before. And that just further frustrated him. And he also felt like he couldn't be himself. And he's afraid he will be deemed as a threat. So if he showed, meaning in other words, if he showed his knowledge, if he showed his ability of memory, he was afraid that that he would be punished and that the people around him would also be punished. So he couldn't fully be himself.
So about Corinne, what do you think about her? What do you think about her justifications?
So I think that while she cared, at the same time, she couldn't see through that black veil that people like Hiram and other slaves could see through, like we were talking about earlier in the semester. She was more, in a way, self-righteous. And when I say that they were more self-righteous and against slavery as a whole instead of the individual slave, I meant they didn't necessarily have a personal connection to it, and instead they saw it as a personal insult. To quote Hiram, they saw it as a personal insult or affront, a stain upon their name. And while they were against slavery, they weren't against the individual slave. If it kind of got the sense, as Hiram was describing, that they didn't think of the individual slave, and instead they were less sensitive and a little more ruthless. And in terms of this veil, like we said before, unless you went through it, unless you were a slave in this case, you wouldn't fully understand. And it talks about how basically slavery, she was against slavery, not necessarily the individual slave, and how it offended a basic sense of goodness that they believed, the other white agents believed, to possess.
So one way we can compare the two books from Beloved and The Water Dancer is the scenes where Hiram chooses to let Maynard die, and the scene where Sethe kills Beloved. They both made this hard decision to end someone's life. They made that hard choice, and we don't know if it's good or bad, truly, because we haven't gone through what they've gone through with slavery, and slavery was influencing these decisions. And then we have the problem with Georgie Parks and how he worked with equality against the other tasked. And the question comes up, was the revenge justified on Georgie? You could say Georgie Parks was a little bit selfish for putting himself first over the other task. He was a free task, and he did get married and have a son. So we could also argue that him doing this was a sign of manhood and a sign that he's protecting his son and his family, and he being an actual father.
So at the end of the day, in terms of whether or not the revenge was justified, we can't judge Hiram because, like we said, we aren't in his shoes. We haven't experienced what he experienced. And at the same time, we can't judge Georgie necessarily because we don't know. Like, there are two aspects, like Vienna said. Like, there's the aspect of he was fending for himself, but he was also fending for his family.
Anyway, guys, thanks for coming to this podcast. I know it was pretty long, but
thank you for stopping by. We hope that it helped understand some of our points of views of the Water Dancer and the ways in which we grappled with the Water Dancer. Stay tuned for more.